Hello everyone, my name is Greg Sullivan and welcome to part 11 of my tutorial series in which I am teaching you how to recreate the Apple Fitness Plus interface using React and Advanced CSS techniques. Now in this part we're going to build the interval timer. During a workout, the interval timer tells you how long you're going to be doing a specific exercise. And so it feels fair to tell you that this is a pretty long portion of our tutorial series. You're going to be here for about 20 minutes. But it's going to be worth it. At the end, you're going to have an interactive interval timer that animates beautifully and even uses a little bit of logic to infer when it should be doing a little bit of a flash to draw attention to itself. So stick around. Let's get started. Let's put 20 minutes on the clock and let's get after it. Let's open up our Explorer, go to Components, New File, Interval Timer, interval timer.tsx. And within the interval timer, we're going to create our interval timer.css. So let's think about the interval timer. What does the interval timer need to know? The interval timer needs to know what the interval is, if it's running. So you can put the 40 seconds on the clock when you're talking about it. The instructor might say, we're going to put 40 seconds on the clock. And then he'll say something else. And then he'll say, ready, go. And the interval timer will start running. So there's a period of time where the interval timer is shown, but it is not running. So the interval timer needs to know what the interval is, whether or not it's running. And then because we don't want any of our components keeping track of their own time, we want one universal source of truth, it also needs to know the current time. So let's do our React props. I'm in the CSS file. React props. We're going to call this interval timer. And the props are going to be, we'll call them is running, current time, and interval. It's complaining that we haven't used any of these yet. Of course we haven't. Over here, it put them all as strings. They're not all strings, so let's fix that. Is running is a Boolean. Current time and interval are both numbers. We can keep them like this. But I don't like doing that, so I'm going to make it into two separate. And for the sake of consistency, I'm going to change this to be called interval time. I had to change it in both places. Okay, so we want to import our CSS. Interval timer.css. And then we want to do a little bit of asset rearranging. So under interval timer, we're going to go new folder, assets. And we are going to move the interval clock out of the root assets into the interval timer assets. And we're going to import that here. We're going to call that interval clock. So import interval clock from assets interval clock. And we go back to our app and we are going to take out the interval timer here, cut that. And here we're going to put in our new component, interval timer. And it's going to take current time, and we have current time. It's going to take interval time, interval what did I call that up here? This is going to be called the, no, we just called it timer. It's not good. So, but that's what we called it. So should have called that interval. The interval timer takes the timer and it takes is running as timer running. And we'll close the component. And we will put these things to work here. We're going to say, change this to a div, give it a class name of interval timer. And we're going to put in H1. And for now, we're going to call it the interval time. Now, as you can see, it's 0. But in a second here, our instructor is going to say, let's put 20 seconds on the clock. And it should change to 20. Or 25. My mistake. There you go. Now, it's just saying 25. Why is it just saying 25? It's just saying 25 because we don't have, we haven't taken advantage of our format time function. So we're going to actually say format time, and we're going to give it the interval time. And then we're going to fix that by importing our timer utility. There's 25 seconds on the clock. And then if we look at what we're making, there is this cool little clock in here. So let's add that too. We already imported it. Let's put it here in the interval timer image. And the source is going to be interval clock. A small clock. It's not small, it's huge, but we'll do some CSS to solve that in a moment. Okay, so what other things do we need to control? Is it running? And the current time, let's put those to use by doing a little bit of math. Because basically we don't want to show the interval time. We want to show how much time is left. So let's create a state here. We'll call it time left and set time left. That's the pattern we use here. We're going to set that to 0. We also need to know what time it was when the timer started. So we're going to call that the time delta. So constant time delta. And we don't want this to change on every render. We want this to be constant. So we're going to say use ref number, and we'll set it to 0. And it is complaining because we haven't imported useState or useRef, so we're going to do that right now. Beautiful. And just like the main app.tsx, we're going to use useEffects to update things. But let's first think about here in a bit of pseudocode what it is we need to know. We need to know how long the timer is supposed to run for. That is the interval time. So 25 seconds or 60 or whatever. We need to know what that is. We need to know whether or not the clock is running. We need to know what the current time was when the clock started running. And what the current time is now. With this information, we can basically take what time was it when the clock started running, what time is it now. That will give us how much time has passed since the clock started running. Then we'll subtract that number from the original interval timer and get our time remaining. That will give us everything we need to know to set the clock correctly and sync it to the main clock. We're going to do that with a series of use effects. So the first thing we needed to know was what time was it when the clock started running. So we're going to get a use effect. Open up the brackets, and we're going to say when, and add the dependency array. This one's going to go and fire only when isRunning changes. Whenever isRunning is changed, whatever we type in here now will run. So what we want is if isRunning, so the use effect has changed. Did it change to true? If so, let's keep going. In this case, we need to know that the math.floor of the current time. And we want to set the time delta, which we set up above, current equal to that. So remember, this is a ref. This only updates when we update it. It doesn't update as part of the render loop. It won't be updated dynamically. We set it here only when this changes and only when it changes to true once. So now we know what time it was when this started running. Of course, we also need to know what time left is. So when time left changes, we want to update time left. So let's add a use effect for that. So we're going to listen for interval time. So when interval time changes, we're going to set time left to the interval time. This just is so that when the JSON changes our timer, we are listening for that and updating. And now here's where all the business gets done. We need to know what the interval was, the interval is, what the time was at start, and the time now. And we need to update this every time current time changes. So we're going to create the use effect again. And the dependency array here is going to just be our current time. So this will run every time current time updates. So what's going to change every time current time updates? First of all, is it running? We don't want to bother doing this if the clock isn't running. So if the clock is running, what do we want to do? We want to set time left. Time left is going to be interval time, so 25 seconds, minus the current time, plus the time that it was when the clock started running, which we know is time delta dot current. Okay. Now we want to do a math.floor of all of this, so we get a good round number. So let's surround that and say math.floor. And we also want this to never be smaller than 0. So it's going to be the max. We're going to surround that with parentheses and say math.max of either what we just passed in or 0. So we're going to get the floor of this equation, which we've discussed, and we're going to round that down so it's attractive. And then we're going to take the max of this value or 0. On the off chance this ever becomes negative 25, we don't want negative 25 seconds left. So now if we save this and run it, we should see the timer countdown. And we should be all ready to go to see it work, but first we have to change what we're showing on the screen. We are not showing the interval timer, we are showing the time left. So save that. Let's refresh this here and run it. You, my fellow developer, can build this cool Apple-style bit of interactivity while working with an appropriate bit of video that won't get me in trouble for copyright issues. Okay, time for our first interaction. Let's put 25 seconds on the clock. Starting easy, and go. Beautiful, it's working great. Exactly what we wanted to see. Take it to home. Now let's do a little bit of styling to get that clock looking good. All right, so to do that, the first thing I want to do is wrap that in a div. We'll create a dot clock holder. We're going to make dot clock holder into display flex. I'm sorry, we're going to make the interval timer display flex. My mistake. I'm going to set the clock holder to a height of 1 rem, 1 m, and an aspect ratio of 1. There's our clock, a little bit big. Let's make the interval timer align items center. And let's make the height on this, I don't know, 0.8 rem, 0.8 m. That looks a little bit better. And instead of center, we'll do flex start. We want to let that breathe a bit, so we'll put a little bit of gap, 0.5 m, 0.5 rem. And now we need to think about getting this clock to turn. So how are we going to do that? So we'll go dot clock holder image, and we'll say transform z, rotate z, and we'll set this to 50 degrees without the single quotes. So it's turned 50 degrees. Great. How about 180? So it's doing what we want it to do, but it's snapping. So the first thing we want to do is change the transition. We want it to be snappy. And just ease out. Think about how a clock moves. So if we were to change this to 270, see that that moves very quickly. So that's looking great. But transforming it here isn't going to do us any good. We need to transform it using an inline style like we did when we were setting the position of the burn bar. So let's go here and add an inline style. What do we want to set this to? We want style, pass it an object, and we're going to pass it transform. We have to use slightly different syntax that comes with React, dynamic string here. I'm going to go rotate z. I want to open up the parentheses. Then we're going to put, this is where we get dynamic. We're going to say time left. I want to divide that by the interval time. If you think about that, what are we doing? We're taking, the interval time was 20 seconds and time left is 10, so we're going to get 0.5. But 0.5 isn't degrees. We could do a little bit of math to turn it into degrees, or we could just use the CSS property turn, and it'll do it for us automatically. Let's save that and see what happens when we hit play. Beautiful. Beautiful. That was pretty easy. The last bit of interactivity I want to cover is that in Apple Fitness Plus, when there's a timer on the screen that isn't running, they flash it. They make it pulse until it's running. So we remember in the app.tsx, we had a moment there where I thought we might set that using the JSON file. But I'm thinking if it's on the screen and not running, it should flash. And we know when it's on the screen, and we know when it's not running. So let's take advantage of that information and make this happen automatically. To make that happen, we're going to use another little bit of inline dynamic CSS. I'll just paste it in here and we can discuss it. We still have interval timer, but now we're going to say, is it running and is the time left greater than 0? Then flash it. We're going to add a class of flash. And otherwise, don't add that class. If we save this, of course, nothing's going to happen. We have to create the CSS. So we're going to do that by creating interval timer. I'm going to add the dot flash. So when it's flashing, we want to run an animation. And we'll call that animation flash. We'll run it for, I don't know, 1.5 seconds. We can always tune this in. We do want to ease this in and out. So we'll do an ease in, out, so it looks nice. And we'll do it infinite times. We'll just run it. Whenever Flash is there, we're going to run it. Let's create this animation. Remember, we create an at keyframes. Or call it Flash, because that's what we just named it. Open that up. And we're going to start with a from. From is wherever it's at when it starts. And we're going to say an opacity of 1. Then we're going to say at 40%, we want an opacity, and let's do 0.25. And then from 80% to the end, well, that's called the 2. We'll call that opacity 1. So let's see if that's working. There it is, and there's our flashing. It should stop flashing, though, when the workout begins. So solid. Beautiful. Now to get that to tween out nicely, we want to go and take the interval timer and give the interval timer a transition. Call it 0.5 seconds and ease. That way when it stops doing the animation, it'll tween to where it's supposed to be. Beautiful. Let's clean this up. Let's go over here and take out or clean up our interval timer TSX. What a beautiful little piece of work. One last little bit of housekeeping is that, remember, we set the style for the color of this in the app.css, and that's not where that goes. Now that we have our own CSS for this, we're going to take the interval timer H1, and we're going to move it over here where it belongs. Again, keeping things clean and portable. All right, great work. 20 minutes done and dusted. Get yourself some water. I wonder how hard this was in the edit bay to make this tutorial 20 minutes. Sorry, Greg, in the edit bay, I hope it wasn't too rough. Anyway, we're really getting used to using state to do what we want, aren't we? And the results show on the screen. We're really getting a lot of great interactivity. In the next part, we're going to use a cool CSS grid trick that you're going to want to know. It's a very powerful technique that lets us dynamically scale elements on a screen without having to use any pre-computed values or any JavaScript React to control things. It's one of my favorite techniques. I can't wait to show it to you next week. As usual, leave your questions in the comments. I'll try to get to as many as I can. And if you have a better technique, share it. I'm always looking to learn from you. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.